in, everybody. I'm Dr. Terry Wager. This is my good friend Kevin Peloso. What do we talk about today, Kevin?
Boundaries.
Boundaries, and like between states, U.S. and Canada. Uh, like what
Could
what
be.
what kind of what do you mean by boundaries?
Talking about personal boundaries, emotional boundaries,
All right, and why
physical
is
boundaries.
why is this important in business?
Because it allows you to set expectations, which makes
Uh,
decision making much smoother.
All right. All right. I like that. We have a lot of ideas in the world about boundaries, and it's one of the topics that I think mental health talks about a lot too. And I have my views on it, and I watch people mess with boundaries and try to figure these things out and try to figure out their way. But um, before we really get into the topic, why don't we read what the dictionary says about boundaries, and then I want to talk a little bit about what that means and what happens when you have them, what happens when you don't, what happens when you think you are using boundaries, but you're doing other things than boundaries. So what's that? What's that?
So the definition: boundaries are personal guidelines, rules, or limits that define how you allow others to interact with you and how you interact with them. They help establish your emotional, physical, and mental space and are essential for maintaining healthy relationships, self-respect, and emotional well-being.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Read that one per piece about how the hows, how you.
Um, Boundaries are personal guidelines, rules, or limits that define how you allow others to interact with you and how you interact with them.
The piece that I'm really keying in on is how you allow others to interact with you. Because one of the first things I think about with boundaries is everybody has this idea of how they should be interact with and how we should allow each person to uh, interact with us, and then we have a decision to make if they're not, and that is, are we going to protect our boundaries? Are we going to get make them do it? And then what happens if we're trying to make them respect our boundary, respect our authority, respect our boundaries? Is like, okay, wait a minute, that sounds interesting. So um, I want to get into that, and I want to talk a lot about that, because this is where we really start to get into emotional intelligence and how to do the interactions without crossing boundaries or disregarding the rights of others, is really what we're talking about there. So why is this important?
Well, I mean, it makes for, why is it important, like from a business standpoint or a personal standpoint, or
Yeah,
both?
isn't it? Isn't it? Business is personal, so
It
yeah.
is. I mean, it ultimately, like I mentioned before, I think the main thing it does is it makes decision making for yourself and for those around you easier when working together, or discussing topics or whatever collaboration somebody's having with you. It sets a guideline of how to interact with you.
Absolutely. Um, and let's get this straight. I think Kevin and I both believe boundaries are very, very important. However, I think that people also take the opportunity to either check out of situations because of boundaries. Sometimes they check out of interactions because of boundaries, and they use boundaries as an excuse to maybe not do some things. And so boundaries is a very interesting thing. Like I have heard often when somebody is feeling embarrassed or upset about some kind of behavior they did, and you question them about it, they go, hey, 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 you're crossing boundaries here. And it's like, oh, okay, so you don't want to be called on your shit. Well, wait a minute. This isn't acceptable in the establishment or in the family or in this relationship the way that I'm experiencing things, but you pull up the boundary sign and, hey, this isn't acceptable. And so we use it as an excuse sometimes. And so, have you ever had anybody do that, Kevin? Use boundaries as
Never.
an excuse?
No, yeah, of course. I mean, it's, people, you don't always like, just because someone has boundaries doesn't mean that they should be there. It also doesn't mean that they should accept them. It's a conversation. It's very relative to the person that has them and the person listening to them, or
Absolutely.
the one that the boundaries are for. So,
Absolutely. And of course, there's going to be naturally, I have different boundaries with Kevin or other people than I have with Christine, and then I have different boundaries with levels of interaction with people I work with versus people who are my social relationships. And so boundaries are fluid, right? But how do we create them?
um, I mean, you have to decide, I guess, what your boundaries are going to be. Or do you mean like where do they come from? Is that more the question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like this idea of boundaries. Where does somebody create their boundaries? Because I mean, we all think we have them, and then hey, you're crossing boundaries. Hey, you said that, and that's mean. Where do they emanate?
Well, societal norms. I mean, depending on how you grew up, who you hang around with, what
Yeah.
your
So
goals are, the circles you're trying to be a part of.
yeah, that's uh, the truth is that boundaries evolve from how we grew up, just like you said, how we grew up, what clubs we're in, what we're in, how we're doing things. I'm in a 12-step organization that there's a boundary about talking about that specifically. And so I use the words 12-step rather than which program to maintain the anonymity that is, I almost said anonymity. That's not a word, but anonymity that they request of us who are in that program because on my bad days, I do not want to be the representative, um, or they don't want me to be the representative, really. And so we respect boundaries based on the idea of where they came from and what the goal of that boundary is. Um, One of the things I also want to talk about is this idea of compartmentalizing and like how do we compartmentalize with boundaries, and is that another way to um, avoid, or is it something to keep us actually performing at our best? What do you think about boundaries and then compartmentalization? I don't know if it's me or if it's you. I cannot hear you.
I forgot to unmute. I'm sorry. Um, so I think they're tools, really. Like, I don't think that they're inherently good or bad. I think it just depends how you use them. Um, you could use them, both boundaries and compartmentalizing. You could use it to your advantage or disadvantage. It just depends. Um, and what was the question? Like, how does one go into the other?
Well, where does compartmentalization fall into the idea of boundaries? Because we have boundaries, and then we have compartmentalizing, and um, a lot of people talk about that. In fact, we were just talking about something right before. Is like sometimes we just have to compartmentalize and put that aside, and absolutely that has to happen. But how does that work?
I mean, I think it depends. Compartmentalizing. I mean, I guess that would depend. Would an example of like compartmentalizing be like if you have a certain boundary, but it changes depending on which like social circle you're in?
Yeah, as
Would
far
that
as that
be
goes, we're gonna maybe our boundaries are going to change, or we're going to act one way and then compartmentalize the way we act in that situation to that situation only, and then in this other situation I can act completely differently. And so compartmentalization, the way I understand the idea, is putting it into a specific situation in a specific way with specific rules, boundaries, that this is the way I behave in this area. um, and I think that it makes sense, and especially with the way we human beings think about and rationalize and tell ourselves the stories that that's possible, and we can do that and we should do that. The problem is does it always go off? Does it work? And can we do that well? um, Thoughts on that?
well, I think that's where the magic is figuring out which boundaries to set, how to compartmentalize it. I think that's the skill because again, it's they're in and of themselves, they're not good or bad, right? Like you could have a lot of boundaries, you could have very few boundaries. I don't think one's necessarily better than the other, but it just depends what are those boundaries. Like let's say you have too many boundaries, well, you might be seen as kind of uptight, rigid. Maybe
Absolutely.
you're not very forgiving, that sort of thing if there's too many. Or on the flip side, if you don't have enough, well, then you might be seen as like a pushover or somebody that doesn't really stand for anything and doesn't really have an opinion on much. So I think there's a happy medium in there somewhere, and I also think it depends on who you are, the context of where you are, how you want to be seen. Of course, you'll have boundaries. Excuse me. You'll have boundaries for um, you have different boundaries for your, say, your professional life versus your personal life. There's just like a very broad example. So I think it just depends on how you personally want to work it.
Yeah. One of the things I think about first off when I first start talking about boundaries, especially when I'm working with somebody that has is very confused about and uses boundaries as an excuse for themselves, or wants to keep information in, or has a lack of vulnerability, is really what I'm trying to say. Is I liken boundaries to the same idea as a tennis court, and I actually have a slide in one of my presentations when I talk about this stuff of a tennis court. If you can imagine that you have the out of bounds line, and then you have the fault lines, and you have all of those different lines for what's in and out, and those are the boundaries of the game. And so these are the rules of the game. This is how we play, and the boundaries aren't um, used to demean people or to hurt them or to uh, take action against somebody if the ball goes out. They're just simply there for us to know whether something's in or out. It looks like you have something to say.
I mean, no, it's yeah, it sets the precedent. It sets the rules of the game of
Exactly.
of or the interactions you're having with other people.
Exactly. And one of the bigger manipulations that people have when they start saying you crossed my boundaries is, did we actually have a conversation around what the boundaries might be? And if there is a boundary crossed, then, and I use the air quotes a lot when I'm talking about boundaries, because we use that as a way to push power sometimes. And so,
Mhm.
has it been discussed? Is there expectations that are clear? What are we talking about with the boundaries? And more than anything, how did your boundaries come to be? And it's really important to kind of think about that, because we have behavioral boundaries. We have rules of what's acceptable and not acceptable around the behavior, around work, or around our relationships, or things like that. But if we never spoke about them, and they're unspoken or they're assumed, then we're walking into a minefield.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, both parties have to agree to the boundaries that are being set, regardless of who's setting them. Just because, say, you have a boundary, let's just say you don't want to be physically touched or physically hit, we'll say. The other person has to agree to that, or else it's going to happen. The boundary will break. So it has to be, um, you have to do your best to make sure it's reasonable. And to Terry's point, discuss it. Not they're not all as simple as what I just said. Some of them are a little more complex and not as obvious.
Right. And, actually, for the last hour and a half or something like that this morning, I've been working on a contract for one of the companies that I'm working with. And it's a basically an employment contract offer letter kind of deal. And it's got a lot of boundaries in there. And then at the end of it, it says, by signing this, you agree to this, and it talks about what the company's going to do for them, and it's going talking about what they're going to be doing for the company and all of the rules of that engagement. And so there's some very, very strict boundaries that are really fortified by this contract. And so those are some really important boundaries as far as behavior and uh, expectations on both sides. And then at the bottom, there's the expectation that you have read this, you've discussed it with either a lawyer or an advisor or somebody that you trust, and make the decision whether you want to sign this or not. And that's a legal contract. It's an employment agreement where they're going to get paid for their services. However, the interesting thing that people don't really take into account, or maybe they do, but they don't think about how what the gravity of it is everything in that contract or everything in behavioral boundaries goes back to emotional experience around those boundaries, because the reality is anytime there's boundaries involved, there's emotions involved. Every time there's a person involved, there's emotions involved. And what's really happening when boundaries are coming up as you crossed my boundary, what they're really saying without using the words or the right words is they're saying, my feelings were hurt in some way because I wasn't expecting something. Even if it was an expectation, I didn't take it seriously. Or if there was no expectation, and I had it unconsciously, I was hurt in some way. And so when people put up the flag like, hey, you're crossing boundaries, what they're really saying is, I'm having an emotional experience here that I don't want. Right. And so then let's talk about compartmentalizing an emotion. Because the interesting thing around compartmentalizing is we can compartmentalize up here all we want. We can compartmentalize in our head very, very easily. It makes total sense because we put the structure in, but do emotions actually agree with or supersede our thinking? And so, and that's a question for you to go ahead and try to answer. Um, can
Oh
we
yeah.
stop our emotions from leaking in?
Um, no.
That is a one word answer. No, we cannot.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't think you really can. I mean, the best you can do is try to manage them, but to completely stop them, even if you think you do, I don't think that's actually what happens.
right. And I would have to fervently agree with that. We cannot stop our emotions because emotions are an experience. They're not a behavior. And the behavior is actually trying to manage them or stop them or trying to compartmentalize, put them in a bucket, and then put them outside. Uh, like how is that going to work? And so the most we can hope to do is to be able to push them off or stuff them And what happens when we start doing that is we're stuffing like a internal cannon, and we're going to explode at some point when we start compartmentalizing emotion. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, people think they're compartmentalizing, but what they're really doing is they're stuffing their emotion. As we stuff it, it starts to boil, and we start to get more and more upset. And then we start looking for where boundaries are being crossed because we have that emotional experience that's pressured, under pressure, and we're feeling attacked by it while we're having that happen. And so what's interesting is when people are experiencing a boundary crossing or a hurt feeling, what often they do is they go, "Ooh, I'm going to draw a line in the sand and say, you can't do that to me." And then, I don't know, have you ever been in a playful mood when somebody says, you can't do that to me? And what do?
Yeah, it makes you want to do it more.
Yes, I can't. Watch this, watch this, watch this. Um, and that's just playing with them.
It's the Barbara Streisand effect,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. And then what happens is, as they get irritated, we think it's funny and we do it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. The other thing is if we're upset and somebody says we can't do that, now instead of, because we're not really thinking about it, if we're upset, they say we can't, then we go bigger and try to prove we can. They say we can't, and what happens is the line in the sand gets erased. We're way over it, and they're way over it. We can't tell where the line is, and we're in a very, very volatile situation, whether it's just words or
It
emotional
becomes a pissing
experience.
match.
Exactly. And it can be, all the way to beating on each other or separating and never wanting to talk to the other person again because you crossed my boundary. Well, what really happened was I was hurt by that situation, and I'm not going to admit that. I'm going to point the finger and say, you hurt me. You crossed the boundary. And then I'm going to move into my head and explain to myself, and then anybody that will listen, how you did that, and all of these situations in a work position. Well, they did this, this, and this, so they're fired, and get rid of them. Or you know, we're not gonna do this again. I'm gonna write you up, and we just bring in consequences for crossing boundaries. Which, when we go back to my idea of the tennis court, when somebody crosses boundaries and we consequence it, what we're doing is we're taking those boundaries, the tennis court this wide, and we're going consequence, 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 consequence. And we move the boundaries in ourselves. We move the lines in the sand or in the playing field together so much that after a few infractions, they can't do anything right. And so we have to be very careful with what we're talking about with boundaries and really understand what boundaries are about, what they're for, and how to actually use them. And so it's late in the day where you are, isn't it?
Yeah,
We'll have to get you a Red Bull. Um,
I need one. I'm sorry.
and so one of the first things when I'm starting to work with people around boundaries is it's really an emotional intelligence issue, and compartmentalizing is a really good idea in mind. But what we're actually doing when we say we're going to compartmentalize is we're actually trying to stuff things. And my biggest suggestion when we're looking at boundaries is look at emotional vulnerability and becoming more vulnerable and talking about what's going on and having the conversation around what you're feeling, what happened, and investigating together with whoever it is about what the boundaries are going to be, what you're going to do if they're crossed, and how you guys are going to repair the boundary if it is crossed. And then having each person, just like in a contract, sign off on it emotionally and verbally. And so it kind of looks like this. When we have the conversation around boundaries, what we're really talking about is emotional vulnerability. And we're talking about I want to go into this relationship with you in some way, and you want to go into it with me in some way, and we're going to have an emotional experience while we do this. And we're all going to have behaviors. We're going to do these behaviors, and some of them we're not going to like, and some of them we are going to be okay with. And when they're not liked, we actually have to admit to ourselves first and then everyone else what happened for us emotionally, so we can actually say, hey, that hurt, or hey, I felt powerless when you said that, or I felt inferior when you said this, or I felt pressured when you asked me to do this or told me to do this. And when we start talking emotionally and be able to identify our emotions and talk about that, people are more than happy to follow along with the boundaries. And the compartmentalizing doesn't need to happen the same way, because we're actually admitting and talking about and connecting with our emotions and sharing those with the other people. Now, a word about the compartmentalization: when you have things happen that you weren't expecting, if we're not identifying our emotions and we're not emotionally vulnerable, and we try to stuff that or compartmentalize it, it's gonna slide out into our situation, and we're going to cross boundaries, or we're going to have our emotions cross boundaries for us and either flood us with emotion when we're not expecting it, or cause us to take things wrong, or cause us to underperform, or try to outperform people out of fear. And it just doesn't go well because we're not aware of our emotions. And so the key with anything around boundaries is really getting comfortable with identifying your emotions, understanding what's going on, understanding your emotional triggers. Because when you do that, one, you can communicate your boundaries, or where you were hurt or where you felt your emotion was triggered, without triggering the other person. And so we can actually respect the rights of others and understand the rights of others and share within those rights what our experience is, and invite them to stay within the boundaries of our own experience and share about why it's important. And if we could all do that, we wouldn't have world wars.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have divorces. We wouldn't have a lot of the different problems that we have. We wouldn't have lawsuits.
The more expressed boundaries you have, the more harmony you have, I would say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it starts with the emotional intelligence, or the emotional mastery of being able to identify what emotions you're experiencing and what they're causing within you. As far as, okay, I was embarrassed, then it triggered my shame, then it triggered my inferiority, then it triggered. And so what emotions all got triggered? And there's 27 emotions out there. And so if we're not able to identify them, then we're kind of going blind and putting boundaries out to protect our emotions, but not to be able to be connecting with our emotions. And so boundaries are almost, in a way to protect ourselves against our emotions being triggered, instead of being able to identify and share the emotion to develop a deeper relationship with whoever it is that is in interactions with you. And so it's a really interesting topic. And I think that it's really worth people diving into a little bit, from the idea of, really, it's about emotional vulnerability when we are talking about boundaries. And if you decide you have to have really rigid boundaries, or you have to be telling everybody about the boundaries that people are crossing, what you are is really not necessarily in touch with your emotions and afraid people are going to be attacking you, rather than being okay with you and you with yourself. And so we put up all of these boundaries. And what happens is, instead of being able to have a relationship, we're having a controlling ship, and a management kind of situation. We're trying to manage other people so they don't trigger us. We're trying to manage ourselves so we don't become triggered, instead of having relationships with ourselves and other people. And so, a very interesting topic, and we're running out of time. And so, I really want to have you, Kevin, throw in your 2 cents about what this kind of wraps into for you. How would you wrap this thing up?
I mean, I would just, to put it simply, the more boundaries you express, the more harmony you'll have. As a general
Absolutely.
rule of thumb, it's that's kind of what it
Absolutely.
comes down to.
And I'm going to put a little cherry on that in 30 seconds or less, hopefully. The more emotions that you can identify within yourself and express those with yourself, and to other people, the easier it will be to navigate boundaries and to have relationships that are actually fulfilling and fruitful rather than feeling like you have to protect yourself all the time. So, with that, we're going to end this one, and we will be back with you next week and have a different, interesting topic.